Yes. I thought it was interesting in the book how there's a lot of God-centered, or lots of references to God up until really the Reformation and then the Enlightenment. And gradually God doesn't get a mention.
There were several comments to make on that. One is that to some extent the Catholic Church was so struck by Protestantism that it went into its shell, so there were virtually no serious Catholic thinkers from about the time of the Reformation to modern day. That didn't help, obviously.
No. Right.
But the second thing is that Protestantism in itself began the process of the corrosion of traditional Christianity.
Yes.
This has been now very well documented by a book by a man called Brad Gregory. He's an American from Notre Dame University. It's called The Unintended Reformation. And he argues there that contemporary secularism is the last stage of Protestantism. The last bits of Christianity have finally been cut off, as it were. Of course, see, what Protestantism did, among other things, was to destroy large parts of the sacramental aspect of Christianity. In the language of Max Weber, that world became what he calls disenchanted. So that religion more and more became shifted into either fear of an omnipotent God in the extreme version, double predestination, as among the Calvinists, or else just a pure moralism. But of course, once you got to that stage, people began to ask the old Platonic question again, why be moral, as it were? And so, yes, God simply begins, it disappears. And of course, eventually it disappears from the churches too. I mean, you can see this in kind of the contemporary churches. I mean, Brad Gregory took to the unintended Reformation, but if you look at the modern Lutheran church, Lutheran would just go crazy. Luther just would, it would seem, this has nothing to do with me, as it were. There's actually no aspects of Lutheranism left in modern Lutheran church. And so, yes, I mean, well, the process just goes on. I mean, God has disappeared not only from secular society, but in many aspects of religious society as well. You probably remember a few years ago there was a great row about the behaviour of the Bishop of Durham, Anglican Bishop of Durham, a man called Jenkins.
Yes.
Jenkins made the remark at one point that the resurrection was a conjuring trick with bones. Well, I myself was once, a little after that, was walking across the campus in Toronto with an retired Anglican bishop. And he suddenly said to me, apropos of nothing, can't understand the fuss about this man Jenkins. So I said, what do you mean? So he said, well, people think he's unorthodox. So I said, well, I've heard him say things myself which wouldn't fit any of the mainline religious Christian traditions. So he said, what do you mean? So I said, well, does he believe in the resurrection of the body? And he said, well, of course he doesn't. Now, if you say that, you've denied what is probably the most basic feature of Christian life right from the beginning of Christianity. The notion of the resurrection of the body is one of the most absolutely fundamental doctrines of early Christianity. If you don't believe that, you're not a Christian at all. That would have been recognized both by Christians and by pagans in the ancient world. It's a quite extraordinary situation. What was happened now is that people are using the name Christian to describe beliefs which have almost nothing to do with original Christianity at all. It's just a word you're using to cover something which you like the sound of the word. It's got the emotional weight or something like that.
Yes, yes. And of course, would you say we see this also coming into the Catholic Church too?
Very much so, yes. Oh yes, certainly it does. I mean, in a piece I wrote recently, I said that Catholics are divided into three groups. One would be traditionalists of some kind, not all of a piece. They dispute among themselves, for example, about the liturgy, let's say. But basically they want to retain what had been taught in basic, quote, faith and morals for 2,000 years. That's one group. And then there's a liberal group which essentially want to secularize as much as possible. That is to try and make the world fit, make the church fit into the modern world without upsetting people too much. You can call these liberals or progressives, and they would say that they're engaging in the aggiornamento of John 23rd. They're updating the church. But of course, if you update it in such a form as to change the obvious meaning of the words of Jesus himself, for example, you've got a problem on your hands. Well, anyway, there's the two groups. But then there's a third group. The third group is much bigger than the others, probably. These are made up in the West of people who've come from Catholic families. They've been brought up as Catholics in places, let's say, like Ireland or Quebec or somewhere like that, where they have a Catholic church that was entirely disappeared. And I call these people tribal Catholics. They grow up as Catholics. They know that they're Catholics, but they don't know why they're Catholics. Yes. So that when they're let loose into a secular world, first of all in a university, but outside of that, for example, too, when the question of marriage comes up, for example, something like that, and since they don't know why they're Catholics, they stop being Catholics. Yeah. Perfectly sensible decision, of course. This is a very large. This is what accounts for the following of people like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and all those, and the Kennedys, all those sort of Catholics who just abandon pretty well all Catholic morality. These people have been brought up as Catholics, but they have never chosen Catholicism because they think it's the right answer. It's just been handed down to them. When they face trouble, it disappears. Well, the name remains. That's a vote getter. But the beliefs have disappeared radically. What the church has failed to realize is that they're in a different universe. See, if you grew up in the Middle Ages, there wasn't much choice. Yes. You could be a Catholic, well, you might be a heretic of some sort, but even then, in most of the heretics, they would be in agreement on most things. Yeah. It was a homogenized world, as it were. But now, you start as a Catholic, if you don't interiorize it when you get to an adult, there's no reason to stay there. And so, I mean, this is affecting the Catholic part, but that's what it is accounting for the radical disappearance of not just of Protestantism now, but Catholicism as well. Particularly in the United States, you see this very clearly happening at the moment. Yes. And in many other...
In the Middle Ages, you wouldn't have anticipated a long enough life to be changing your mind.
No, that's another aspect, though, which again we talked about in the book. If your life expectancy is 30, you don't expect to be facing situations where you seem so different to yourself in later life. But in the 18th century, the theory grew up that we are a series of serial selves. And you can see why people would think this. I mean, if you think back to your own time when you're a student or something like that, in the 20s, I've done this as a thought experiment myself. Try to remember what you believed and why you believed it. Often you think, well, this is absolutely mad. But if you're only going to live to be 35, you won't have so much of that experience. No. If you can live to after to be in your 80s, then you've got to have it all the time. The proper attitude to this, of course, is not what I call the serial self, which derives in its modern form from 18th century philosophers like Hume or Locke. But Newman made a comment about this when he talking about his own conversion, because he wanted to know, as indeed I wanted to know when I had a similar experience, why one suddenly would found oneself believing something which in the past you didn't think was possible. He uses the phrase in the Apologia, 10 years later I found myself in another place. The whole man moves. Paper logic is the record of it. Now that is a very common modern experience, and it's very different from what has happened often in the more distant past. In the early days, when people converted to Christianity, it was often a sort of road to Damascus experience. A sudden change, not only to Christianity, but to other religions or to philosophy, all sorts of things. But now, because of what's referred to as the hermeneutic of suspicion, the fact we've been learned from Freud and people like that there are hidden motives which we need to understand when the way we behave. it's very unusual to get those instant changes. It happens over time, just like Newman says. 10 years later, I found myself in another place.
Yeah.
So this is a feature of the modern world. Well, if you may not find yourself in another place if you all the time you're moving with people who are already where you don't want to, we think you don't want to be. I mean, I can think of people, for example, who were journalists, not Catholics, but they were Christian. You join the journalists. After 3 or 4 years, you find yourself in a position of, oh, aren't you divorced yet? You're the only one here who isn't. And you're in a different world, and if you're a Catholic, let's say, and you don't know why you're Catholic, then you can see, well, yes, I was a different person then. When I married her, I'm a different person where I am now, and she was a different person who married me. Therefore, why not get divorced? Right. We're not the same people at all. We're not even married. We were married. We aren't now because we're not the same people.
Professor Rist, you're one of the foremost experts in St. Augustine. He's mentioned in the book. Can you tell us what we can learn from his thinking to help us come out of this quagmire of confusion that we're in at the moment?
Well, Augustine is a strange figure. He dominates thought in the West from the time of his own life, and he knew he would, and for various reasons concerned with his own lifetime. Now, he's an interesting figure because in a way he's at a world a bit like ours, surprisingly enough. When Augustine was a young man in North Africa, he was living in the stablest province of the Roman Empire, and he could have assumed that the world would always be like that. When he died, 70-odd years later, he was being besieged in his city by the Vandals, who had already destroyed most of North Africa, wiped out the Roman armies and so on in that part of the world. And the old world had come to an end. The city of Rome had been destroyed by the Goths, or sacked by the Goths at one point, 410, so that he witnessed changes of extraordinary speed. From the time when the Roman Empire appeared to be universal and almost going to last forever, to the time when it had virtually collapsed in the West. Anyway, it collapsed in the West. So in that sense, he's in a time of very, very rapid change. And therefore, as a man speaking in times of rapid change and aware of rapid change, that's one of the first reasons why he's of peculiar interest, because he's very perceptive about what people are doing in a changing universe, as it were. Now, of course, the problem with him historically has been that although he realized he was going to be very influential, probably not as much probably as he really was, but nevertheless he did realize it. What he didn't realize is that his views would be distorted, confused, argued about. Everyone claimed to be an Augustinian in the Middle Ages. Everyone claimed to be an Augustinian in some sense, but they had radically different views, and there were all sorts of reasons why this happened. But in some cases, it was because of the change of education. Augustine was educated in a way that typical Roman in the, as it were, upwardly mobile class would be educated, standard Latin education. He read widely in Latin writers, he'd read widely in philosophy and so on. But in the Middle Ages, to begin with, apart from the Bible and one or two other bits and pieces, he was the only person read. So he was, in a sense, the major carrier of ancient things into the later world, but in a confused form. Right. And that confusion was added to in all sorts of ways. One, because in medieval times only bits of his work were known, and different bits in different places, so you could read him differently by reading different parts of his book or his collection of books. Secondly, because the medievals, and indeed many modern people too, or near-modern people too, assumed that a thinker would always have the same thoughts. This is an absolutely bizarre claim, of course, and it doesn't work in the case of several major philosophers, including Kant and Wittgenstein. Nevertheless, it was widely assumed by most people that Augustine, for example, had a single view of the universe, which isn't true, and he knew it wasn't true, and he said it wasn't true. He says, if you read my books in the order I wrote them, you'll recognize the development and change in my thought. But either the medieval didn't know those texts, in some cases that were the case, or when they did know them, they didn't take any notice. So he's turned into a systematic figure. And the system you construct is going to be different from case to cases, but in almost all cases, on some basic issues, it's not going to be what he himself would have liked. Yeah. So that in many ways, the advantages of Augustine got lost, while some of the more extreme and less attractive features of him became emphasized, and indeed became some of the reasons for the unpopularity of Christianity in general. Right. In the case of over predestination, for example, this would be the case. I mean, Augustine's position is very difficult to understand. But the Catholics, Protestants of various sorts, all interpreted it differently. Probably none of them got it entirely right, in fact, actually, because it's not one position. It changes and it goes back and forth, and he's unclear in many ways where he finishes up. I think all you can say is that some interpretations are clearly wrong, and often these are the ones which are particularly disliked now and have brought Christianity into disrepute. Yeah. But that's just the way history works, as it were. Yes. I do want to emphasise, though, that he, in contrast to other Catholic thinkers in the Middle Ages, like Aquinas, for example, he is not a systematic thinker. He's basically a preacher. He's adapting what he knows to individual cases. And this is, of course, one of his particular strengths, because he doesn't talk in the abstract very much. Augustine is very concerned not with saying you should be a good guy, as it were, but what are your individual strengths and your individual weaknesses? That's what the preacher's got to do. Not to talk in a vague sort of way. You've got to be brave, you've got to be correct, you've got to be self-controlled, and so on. You've got to talk about what is right or wrong with you individually. The notion of the importance of the individual there in Augustine it was largely lost, I would say, actually, in the Middle Ages, and it's being recovered now very gradually. But it was an absolutely fundamental part of his attitude, and as I say, you can see it. If you say he's not a systematic philosopher, he's a preacher, he's a biblical exegete, and he applies these things to problems of particular individuals in a particular society, as it were. And that is a guide, as it were, it seems to me, for the right kind of preaching from a Christian point of view.
So do you think, from what you said, that if we get St. Augustine properly interpreted and better interpreted, that's one possible solution to helping us out of this confusion, especially with regards to Christianity and how that's seen?
Yeah, Augustine represents, I would say, the best of a wider attitude in the early centuries of the Church. And one of the features of this is a very pragmatic approach in many ways to religious belief. Augustine doesn't really offer you, for example, proofs of the existence of God, which proofs will always be disputed. What he does is to suggest that if you think about a fixed problem and try and solve it without reference to God, you'll come up against a brick wall. If you add God in, you can solve that problem. Now, if you do that once, that's interesting. If you do it twice with different problems, it gets more interesting. If you do it 3 times more. In other words, he's talking about you reach a stage where, as it were, from his point of view, it's irrational not to believe in the existence of God. It's more rational to believe in God than to believe that he doesn't exist, or even that we don't know whether he exists or not. Because it just happens to work out, as it were, that if you accept his existence, then you can resolve all sorts of otherwise irreconcilable difficulties. Now, of course, those difficulties are such that there is, of course, as I said before, the extreme Platonic alternative, i.e., for example, I'm primarily interested in moral philosophy, that it doesn't exist, that mind you, it's very difficult to imagine yourself actually taking this position seriously, because most people, as it were, however much they deny the existence of God, may behave in such a way as to assume that if you pursue the logic of their beliefs, then God is still there. They don't want to admit that. This is an extreme example of the argument that the skeptic can't, the ultra-skeptic can't live his skepticism. You will in the end find yourself making assumptions which you think are secular, but in fact, if you analyse them, they can't really be solved in secular terms. Now, Augustine will encourage you to think in this kind of way.
Yeah, and it's often said, though, isn't it, that because there's a collapse in faith, that the reason has also collapsed, and there's a crisis of reason as much as faith.
Yes, that's right. But you see, that's partly because of the account of reason, which is supposed to have collapsed. Until the 16th, 17th century, people distinguished two different sorts of reasoning. One was what we would call instrumental rationality. That is, you reason how to do something or other which you want, or it seems to be a good idea, or something like that. Instrumental rationality. If you go back to Greek, there's a special word for that kind of reasoning. But until comparatively recently, there's also been another notion that there is an ability in human beings not to reason like that, but to have a direct awareness of truths without any intermediate term. Now, the best example of that kind of thinking, which would of course be necessary in some sense to recognize the existence of anything outside the spatio-temporal realm, but the best example of it is what happens when you think about some other human being. If someone said to me, well, what's Ed Pentin like? I could start analysing, mentioning his size, his voice tone, what I think he knows, and so on, a whole series of things like that. And then I'd stop, and my interlocutor would say, is that all? And of course the answer is no. You can't sum up the individual in terms of his parts, but nevertheless you do know, unless you're a Humean that is, that he is one person, as it were, who is greater than his parts. Now that's not a reason, that's not what that's not a bit of instrumental rationality, that's the use of the mind in a different way. And it would have to be, of course, that sort of mind which you'd need to recognize the existence of God, that would have to come in. You suddenly realize that things add up, and it means, there's one thing out there, I suppose, as it were, like one person, but there's God. But if you say, as people have tended to say since the 16th and 17th century, and markedly in the 18th century and from now on, reason is all instrumental. That's all that we can do. If that's what reason is, then of course you've immediately ruled out any possibility of any kind of religion or any kind of spiritual experience at all. Not only can you, in matter of fact, not explain ethics, you can't explain aesthetics either, and all sorts of other things you can't explain. This other kind of reasoning, I would call it's first personal. It's not. If you've seen it, as many mystics, both Christians and non-Christian mystics, talk in this, or they will say something like, "I can tell you various things about God, let's say, but that isn't going to make you know what God is. But if you see it, you know what I mean." That's the immediate use of the reason, and that's in this other sense, as it were. If you deny that other sense exists, and you fall back on the other instrumental account, all you've got left is some thesis about reason, that reason is nothing other than the slave of the passions, as Hume put it. That seems to me to be a false account of reason, and I think Plato also had recognized long ago that that's a possible account that's wrong. But that's the dominant mode, as it were. Reason is a means by which we can get things done. That goes back to Descartes in modern times, among others. It's a means which we can control nature, for example, according to Descartes. if you think that's all we can do, you've offered, it seems to me, a very, very debased and reductionist account of what human beings are capable of. And the modern position depends on it. Now, that's if you start seeing through that, then, of course, you've got a crisis of reason. If that's all reason is, it's not much good. And so now we have, in the postmodern world, there is indeed a crisis of reason, just as there is in fact. That's what postmodernism means, of course. It means that you've denied the rationalism of the Enlightenment.
Yes. And who do you think is most responsible for this? I heard it recently that Immanuel Kant is probably the most guilty figure in philosophy for the situation we're in today. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no. In one sense, Kant is the summing up of a process which begins with Descartes, or even with Suarez, and Kant, and he's often regarded as a way of protecting traditional virtues without God. Kant himself does believe in God. He thought he destroyed arguments for the existence of God in order to put it, I've got rid of knowledge in order to give way for faith.
Right.
But of course, people will say, well, what faith? Pretty quickly, and did. So that the next generation after Kant immediately became atheist. Well, many of them did, or sometimes pantheist. So he was, in that sense, he is a very important figure, but he's also a figure who now, he gives respectability to positions which are less respectful than they ought to be. If you want to go down a whole postmodern route and say that, with Foucault and people like that, the only thing that matters is power, then if you don't like that sort of idea, if you want to make out there really are real virtues, for example, not just power, you can appeal to Kant to defend them. But in my view, of course, Kant's defence just doesn't work. His arguments for moral morality seem to me to beg the question at almost every point. I think Kant built into his system before it starts the Christian notion of a person as being a, quote, sacred. That is, shouldn't always be used as never be used just as a means, but always also as an end in himself. I don't think Kant ever shows that he's argued that philosophically. It's an assumption he's built into his system from Christianity. Right. So in a sense, he's using capital, which he's got no right to have.
Right.
And his followers have even less right to have it.